Hello and welcome to Mythic Mind Games, where we discuss video games through the lens of the Christian humanities. I'm Dr. Andrew Snyder, and I'm glad that you're here. Hey there, welcome back to the first episode in a two-parter on Zelda. And if you're listening to this on the public feed, that's the non-Patreon feed, then you'll notice that we have back-to-back episodes here. We just had episode last week. We're gonna have another episode next week. And so originally my design was for this to start off every other week, but things just happened, so we kind of had some episodes stockpiled here. Didn't want to hold on to them for too long, and so we're doing back-to-back for now. But I can't guarantee that we're going to be able to keep that up. And in fact, we probably won't unless I get some more support that allows me to divert attention from elsewhere to really get into providing weekly episodes here, maybe even more than weekly eventually, if we hit the right levels of support that allow me to do that. And so if you like what we're doing here, if you like this conversation that you're about to listen to today, then head over to patreon.com/mythicmind and lend your support. Get involved in this community, whether you are a silent supporter or you're more actively involved in joining some of our shows and whatnot. I definitely welcome your company. But today, as I said, it's the beginning of a two-parter on Zelda, and Zelda is obviously a major franchise. It has a major grip on our culture. Even people who aren't really active in video games are at least generally familiar with Zelda. It's one of those franchises that extends from the NES up to the current iterations. It's about as much of a mainstay as Mario, which is pretty significant. And whenever you have a franchise that has this kind of enduring value, I'm convinced that it has that enduring value. It has that staying power because it resonates with certain eternal realities of the human experience, certain desires, certain longings, certain things that we're looking for, whether we consciously recognize that or not. In our Star Wars conversation, I've talked about how Star Wars is something like a modern mythology. And what makes mythology significant is it's something like a public dream, as Carl Jung or Joseph Campbell would say, in that it speaks to something that happens kind of in our own psyches, but in a way that we can visibly and communally recognize together and engage with. And so I think that Zelda has that kind of mythological power to it, which is why it's such a major franchise. And that being said, in the conversation we're about to listen to as I'm joined by David and Josh, they really lead this conversation. As I mentioned, my experience with Zelda really ends with the N64, back with Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask. And so I participate to the extent that I'm able here, but really Josh and David are going to be carrying this conversation, and so I appreciate them. But next week we'll have more of a targeted kind of conversation. We'll have an interview with Anthony Cirilla, who is a professor at the College of the Ozarks, and he has co-edited a book of essays on Zelda and Mythopoeia. So he's going to be a good resource to go even further with this investigation into the Legend of Zelda. But for now, I hope that you enjoy this general conversation with Josh, David, and me. And let's go ahead and get to it now. All right, welcome to our latest episode of Mythic Mind Games as we talk about Zelda. Now, I haven't played Zelda since N64 days, Majora's Mask and Ocarina. Played Link to the Past, but not since Super Nintendo days. So I'm going to be a little bit out of the loop on this conversation, but I fully expect that Josh and David will be able to carry it. And so I'm going to let Josh really sort of MC this conversation. And so, Josh, go ahead and take it over.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Thanks for the honor and privilege of emceeing this. So this should be fun. So yeah, just in typical Mythic Mind fashion, I figured it would be best if we just talked about our just general overall experience with the Zelda. So, Andrew, you kind of explained yours, but did you want to say anything further on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's about it. I mean, I had I had older brothers, and so I had the gold cartridge NES Zelda. I had the Link to the Past. Ocarina is really what I would consider to be my Zelda game, the one that with so many people, right? That's the one that stuck with my imagination. That's stuck with me over time. My cat comes to me when I whistle a Epona song. Like it's the one that stuck with me. And I just especially taking a pretty much a hiatus from playing games. I miss a lot of what's happened since then in the world of Zelda. And so that's about where I am for this topic.
Dave, you can go next.
Oh yeah, well for me, I'm video game wise, I feel like I'm probably the biggest geek in this group. So I think it was in sixth grade, maybe seventh grade when The Legend of Zelda came out, and I blew through it in like a week, and I've played all of the other ones at release pretty much. So yeah, I've it's been a part of my life since like, the early teenage years on, and I've always really enjoyed the themes and the sense of exploration and all that aspect of it. So I'm looking forward to talking about it.
Yeah, and I'll definitely want to really lean into your insight a lot on those early games. I'm not calling you old, by the way. Your wisdom is appreciated, and that is not, I'm not just saying that as sincere and genuine. So for me, not really having the experience of a lot of the NES and SNES games, I dabbled in them when I was older, and there was like emulators and things like that. But based on like the timing and I was born, Ocarina of Time was the first Zelda game to come out in my lifetime. I was like 3 or 4 when it came out, and it's kind of same thing with me, Andrew. It's like that was like the game that was like the game of like my entire childhood. There's not a single game that was really more influential and really that stuck with me more probably in like the first like 16 years of my life or so than Ocarina of Time. So it was like a 9 year span of me like playing that game, getting a little bit further, getting frustrated, taking a break, coming back to it because I was a little kid and I just wasn't smart enough to I just wasn't smart enough to get past Jabber Jabber's belly and then the Forest Temple and then the Water Temple and then the Shadow Temple after that. So but I played Majora's Mask when it came out, revisited and beat that one later. I think like Wind Waker was the first one that I actually would when it came out, I was actually able to beat it like all the way through without having to take breaks. But Twilight Princess was probably the one that also really hit me at a really good time too, because I was about 11 when that came out. Got it when the release of the Wii itself that was one of the games that came with it, or one of the options you had, I think. And so I played that one. I felt like it was just dark enough where I was just the right age to play that at the right time. So they all stuck with me. I like Skyward Sword too, but I was so fed up with the Wii remote system by the time Skyward Sword came out that I actually never finished it because I was sick of like fighting like this all the time. So I admit I never finished it, but I know the story and it was an excellent origin story. I guess since I'm driving this discussion, unless like, Andrew had something to say, I don't want to rant too much about my experiences because they're lengthy. They'll probably come out as we go through this, but I think one thing I did want to talk about this, and we have this interview scheduled with Anthony Cirilla, who's really a great voice in this realm. He edited a book on like the basically mythopoeia in Zelda. I can get you the exact title if you want, but um, this whole idea there is that like Zelda's not just like the Legend of Zelda series is not just like a childish game. It is in some sense, but it's also it's childish in all of the best ways, right? Like just like as the great fairy tales and the great romances of the medieval and Renaissance and even like to some extent the modern era are as well. And I think, one of my goals here this in this chat and with the chat with Anthony 2 days from now that this really debunks the idea that Legend of Zelda is just an adventure game for kids and that there's not a lot of literary or philosophical depth in it. Because I think one of the really interesting things about Zelda is that so Shigeru Miyamoto, the creator, also created Mario, also created Donkey Kong, later created Star Fox in the 90s. So that was all those others were created in the 80s. And this game really, and Dave, perhaps you could speak to this in a second, but it's like it really pushed like from my understanding at least, just reading the history of video games, it really kind of pushed like the really the literary and narratival elements of a video game. It was kind of revolutionary in a sense where like you're not playing Pong with your buddy in his garage. Like you're not Mario jumping over the barrels that Donkey Kong throws at you, right? Like you're not Super Mario Bros. Like there was an actual like, you know, the original Zelda game from '86 is it's a role playing game, and there's a story, and there's text, and there's items, and like a not an open world, but for its time, a pretty open world to explore in a way. So, Dave, if you wanted to actually say more about that, I think you'd be the right person for that topic.
Yeah, I think that's something that was really revolutionary about the first one was that it doesn't have a score. You know, you don't get 100 points for stabbing an Octorok or anything. The whole point of the game is just to explore this world, and your hand isn't really held. You know, you have to walk into that first cave, and the old guy gives you a sword, and from there you can go in any direction and just when you run up against a wall, you try to figure out how to get past that. And I've seen where Miyamoto said that was kind of inspired by just exploring the countryside when he was a kid. You know, he'd find caves or ponds and things like that, and he wanted to kind of latch on to that sense of wonder and exploration and discovery, which I really feel like they didn't capture again until all the way to Breath of the Wild, where you could just go in any direction and you would stumble across things to do. But I mean, even the dungeons in the original Zelda, like sometimes you would have to burn the right bush and a staircase would appear, and that's how you found the dungeon. So, like, as a middle schooler, I would pass friends in the hallway between classes and be like, "Whoa, hey, I found, where the fourth dungeon is or whatever." So there was a lot of fun, especially before the internet when, now you're only stuck for 2 minutes until you Google a video where somebody's got a complete walkthrough. But yeah, before this, most games were arcade games where the goal was to try and convince people to put more quarters in a machine. So the score and getting your name on the scoreboard was the only goal. But they started to slowly realize, hey, we can tell real stories. The people have already bought the game. Let's just make it an engaging, enjoyable experience. So yeah, that was a good point.
Yeah, I appreciate your perspective. I think there was like a version of that that released on like it was like a re-release for the Game Boy Advance when I was a little kid, probably 2001, 2002, roughly. And that was like the only time I played it. And of course, growing up playing like Ocarina of Majora's Mask, I was like, this is hard, and he's like 8-bit, and as a kid, I just didn't get it. But one day I will go back and probably try to play those. So we will see if I can actually do it. They're very challenging in their own right too. But I kind of want to just like talk about like just this idea of like just there being just beauty, meaning, and such things in the Zelda series. So I kind of see like Hyrule as something of it's kind of like something like of like a adventurous world in like a romantic sense, right? Like where it draws you in, it's imaginative. It's kind of like it's almost like reading like a George MacDonald novel, like Fantasties or something, where it's like there's this beautiful world that draws you in, and not everything's just explained to you. And I think in our um, postmodern society, not directly picking on postmodern ideologies directly, but just in general how people today like view literature and writing and TV. And Andrew is comment maybe more comments later, but people like just are very critic. People have a very critical spirit today, and sometimes I think Zelda can almost get passed over in a conversation because it's not always as obviously written through, explicit dialogue in the way like Final Fantasy is, right? Where you have these back and forths between a whole cast of characters for 30 to 70 hours sometimes of like gameplay, and where things are explained to you in cutscenes, maybe a little bit more at times even. I think Zelda can kind of get over past, and I would say like wrongfully so in that for sure. But I also think in general too, what I'm also getting at there is there's no a story doesn't have to always be on the nose and told with a really rich and robust narrative. Like I am a fan of novels just as much as I am a fan of poetry, and I teach both of those things to middle schoolers, and they both have their purpose, right? It's good to read like a well fleshed out 400-page book, it's also good to work through a poetry collection where sometimes you only have like, you know, 16 lines of poetry that paints you a picture in its own right. And so I think there's something about the world of Zelda that's just incredibly poetic in its own right. But that's paired in another sense too, I think, with yes, like the characters are fleshed out in a way. It's just not there's may not be as much dialogue, but it's mythological in a sense too. And it's mythological in the sense that you've got basically every game is like its own episodic tale, right? Like you have an introduction and there's tension and there's a plot and there's a beginning and there's a middle and there's an end. There's an antagonist, often Ganon or Ganondorf, right? There's the protagonist is always Link. Zelda is usually, if not always, in the game, and she's sometimes a damsel in distress, often, but she's also more than that. But these episodic encounters, they all roll up to a higher meaning and a higher really meta narrative overall, if you may. And it makes it kind of the same things that we appreciate about mythology, right? Like you read like the story of Prometheus, or then you go read one of Homer's epics, or then you go read like Hesiod's Theogony, like the tales of like the Greek gods. And they're all part of a greater mythos, right? And I think in a sense Zelda is the same way. And it's really we can talk about this more later if you all desire to do so, but there's a higher mythological significance to it. And there's beauty just even in the way that they interconnect, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I'd like to get to some of that mythology in a second, but at first, in emphasizing that Zelda perhaps tends to be more of a poetic experience than strict narrative, which it is. I mean, at least in my experience, which again, it's fairly limited at this point, that there's not a lot of story. Again, from going like in 64 days and behind, there's not a lot of story built into it. Like you can outline the story pretty quickly. And so when you describe it as being poetic, what do you mean by that? What makes the Zelda franchise poetic?
Yeah, man, that's a really good question. And I think just kind of speaking just very like high level, I think one of the I mean, and I kind of hinted at this earlier, but one of the biggest differences in poetry and like prose really is sometimes just merely the fact that like you get word images in a sense, right? And they're not just word images, but you get these, they're almost like mosaics in a way where you get these different lines of poetry that come together and they're beautiful in their own right, like as their own fragments or their own pieces. But they as pieces and fragments come together to a whole and make a picture that's, 10 times, maybe 100 times more beautiful at times because they all come together in concord and they work in a harmony in a sense. And I think there's something about, and maybe it's just as simple with Zelda as, and this conviction probably grows deeper just again in context of our postmodern society that um it's merely just enchanting and people might say, well, it's just like a forest, it's just a castle, it's just there's just Koroks and there's just fairies and Hylians and it's like yes, but it's like that's where you want to spend your time sometimes, and especially just in the arguably the most disenchanted society we ever lived in, right? I mean, this is why in the 19th century the Romantics like Wordsworth and Coleridge and Keats and later on MacDonald and others were really pushing back, is because there was a about 100 years of just disenchantment post enlightenment in the Enlightenment and post enlightenment, and I think we are honestly seeing a lot of parallels there in our time where it's like postmodernism is really ugly in every form, and I think sometimes just immersing yourself in a beautiful world in of itself is profound and meaningful, and like you do get characters within that, and sometimes it's just a mere matter of show rather than tell. Things get explained to you in a lot of more RPG based, like we talk about the Elder Scrolls sometimes here, and it's like the amount of conversations you can have in the Elder Scrolls or in Knights of the Old Republic, and I love that they're made that way, but it doesn't mean that Zelda is not meaningful because you can't just walk around the town and talk to like, you know, 20 different guys, even though they all have the same voice a lot of the time in Elder Scrolls. Um, there's something to it where it's like you're being shown a lot of things, but you're not always being told. And when you're not being told, you can ask questions. And when you're not being told the answer, you can ask more questions and you can think about it longer. And you don't always get a direct answer. And sometimes that's really fun and really invoking of wonder just in general.
And I'm thinking back on a lot of these games, most of them open by showing, you know, carvings on a wall or tapestries explaining something that happened in the ancient past. I think of like Wind Waker and even the beginning of Link to the Past and what's the most recent one? Tears of the Kingdom and Breath of the Wild. They have that aspect going to them. So it's like, okay, we have these old stories, and then we're put into the modern world where people are just living their lives. And then lo and behold, there's truth in these stories. They're not just stories, you know? And uh, I think that's an important thing for people to have in their minds that, yeah, just because a story is old does not mean it has no value, that it's something to be forgotten, that there are deep, important truths in the old tales.
Yeah, and I appreciate the connection you made with the romantics because it's really in the romantic period where, especially in the arts, landscape becomes a character. It becomes a focus of attention in a way that you really just don't see, at least predominantly in the art that comes before it. That's one of the things that Lewis says about Beowulf. Beowulf's obviously not romantic, but he says it's exceptional in the fact that the landscape is a character, something that you don't really see widespread in until the romantic period. And so that definitely does feed into sort of the, I don't know, the Zelda aesthetic, right? Where it's about, I don't know, being more than becoming, I suppose. And I mean, I should caution that the romantics can go a little wild, but focus on exactly what it is that we're talking about. I think that's a good connection.
I would argue that Shelley and Byron probably get more unnecessarily wild in the wrong ways than the others, just for people who don't have that context. But read Wordsworth, guys, and Keats, and some of Blake. But anyway, we won't belabor that any further. So I think one thing. Um, did you have something, David, before I moved on to the next
Well, I
point?
was just thinking about Link and the way that he doesn't speak. And we've talked before about how often in games the main character won't speak as because you're supposed to be able to put yourself in that position. That's kind of a philosophy that some games take, and this one's definitely one of those. But I think it also works as part of his character because he doesn't really need to speak. You know, he knows what his mission is. He knows right and wrong. He knows the task at hand. So it becomes kind of part of his heroic quality that he doesn't waste his time with words, I think. So I think sticking through that, even when they've been able to, you know, have voice actors for everyone else if they want to, that they keep Link silent has always just become an aspect of his character that is a heroic quality.
Yeah, I think that's a good perspective, especially because I've definitely seen just generalized like YouTube video essayers or game reviewers just kind of pick on Link because he's like boring or one dimensional, and I think it is it's just like the point that this all exists in a context of higher meaning, and you can not like it, like that's fine, but there's more to think about than meets the eye, and that's really a motif for understanding Zelda, I think, in a lot of ways. But another thing I wanted to talk about was, and this is certainly important to me, as I'm sure it is to others, but just like the role of music in Zelda and even how that plays into the world. Because not only is the music beautiful, but I think the music is pretty much always beautifully fitting in its right context for where you are in the world, what's going on in the story. But even by itself, it is, I mean, I think it is some of the best video game composition of all time. I think it's certainly some of the most well known, but I can't even. It's hard to even go into like if I had to make like a top 10 list or start just naming off favorites. I'd just be all over the place, and there's not many game series long standing like this that I can say that for. And it's not just good or iconic in a way that it's catchy, but it's again, it's beautifully composed. It's harmonious. Like everything works in concord with the other parts of it. It's like a symphony. I live in the Detroit area, and the Detroit Symphony Orchestra performed the Zelda music a few years ago, and I went, and it was wonderful. It was, I don't know if I could say on par with like Mozart or Bach, but it's if it's not on par with them, it's a tier or two down, which is still a massive, massive compliment in my opinion. And I think music is actually one of the best parts of the entire series. And I mean, let's just be very frank here that like music is important and it's beautiful and it's there's hardly many things more enchanting than that. In George MacDonald's essay, The Fantastic Imagination, he says in quote, "The best way with music, I imagine, is not to bring the forces of our intellect to bear upon it, but to be still and let it work on that part of us for whose sake it exists. We spoil countless precious things by intellectual greed." And I think there's a sense there where, again, people, everything has to be boiled down to like science and rationalism sometimes. Like, oh, the writing has to be completely understandable. That dialogue didn't make sense to me, therefore it's stupid or it's poorly written. Or I don't like this character because they're silent or something, right? People can say, oh, it's just music, but it's like, yes, it is just music, but sometimes music is above and beyond even the writing of a video game or a novel or a short story in general. And so I think just the role of music in general. Anything you guys want to say about that, or even if you have some favorite pieces, please feel free to share.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that's an important point that we're talking about something like music or, I mean, so much of aesthetics that it does, when it's done well, it does speak to not an irrational part of us, but the sub-rational part of us, that part of us that stands beneath our rational nature and upholds it. We talked about this recently in one of the Star Wars conversations over for the movies and shows podcast, that the Christian position is that it's really also Plato's position that once you get to the limits of reason and you start to approach that by which you reason, well, now you're outside the bounds of reason. Right? And that's fundamentally where it is that we come from, which is why the great, most rational medieval Christian thinkers have a mystical component to them, where even your Thomas Aquinas or whoever, like you get to the limits of your reason, and now you find that the ultimately the place that you're from, right? As Lewis would say, till we have faces, like the place where all the beauty comes from, is this part of us that we know that we belong to, but that we can't necessarily comprehend rationally. In music, art in general, it done well speaks to that part of us, where there may be elements of it that we can kind of point to with words, which words are signs, but they're not the thing in itself. And good music does is sort of like the thing itself communicating to us as much as is possible. And so I definitely agree that in the most enchanting games, the games that are for the most part most worth playing, they have incredible soundtracks because they do such a good job of hitting that part of us. So I think that's an important point.
Yeah, and the original Zelda, music on the NES was really tricky because they had to keep it short and looping and not drive you insane while you're playing the game. But the original Zelda, which I forgot, I brought visual aid. So here's my American copy of Zelda, and this is the Japanese release that came out about a year and a half earlier. It is on a little tiny floppy disk. The Famicom disk system is what they released it on. Um, but they couldn't fit a lot of music on those. So I think there's maybe five or six little loops in the original Zelda, there's the title screen, the overworld, the dungeons, the final dungeon, and then the credits pretty much. So um yeah, it sets the tone and it sets your mood because of the way that music is able to influence us, as you were saying, Andrew, the way that it touches you in a way, I mean, you can't even really put into words. So
Yeah, and as much as video game music has obviously become more sophisticated with the technology, that there is something charming about the old tunes on the NES and SNES.
yeah, designing and creating under constraints is a sometimes creates things that you wouldn't get otherwise, because they have like four four or five channels to work with, and I don't think they could loop something that was very long. So to get such iconic things like the Zelda overworld theme and the Super Mario theme, stuff like that, is pretty impressive.
I did actually shut my camera off to provide a not nearly as cool visual aid, but these are from my childhood. Still have them sitting in here. Don't know where my Wind Waker and Twilight Princess discs are though, so a little sad.
Now, where's your Japanese ocarina?
It's it's in storage. I have
Oh,
one.
okay.
Of course, I have one.
The Japanese ocarina cover is actually, I don't think it's as good as the American one. It's a rare case where that's the case, but
I'll be,
that
I'll
that's
be,
sorry. That's my
I'll be more
collecting
impressed with.
nerd there. Yeah.
I'll be more impressed with somebody presenting a like an original laser disc of the 1980s Zelda cartoon series.
Oh my
So
gosh.
that's what I need in this conversation.
There's another example of why it's good when Link doesn't talk. Like because then you can end up with things like that abomination. Yeah.
I
Totally
actually
American made, very obviously. That is not how he would have been portrayed in Japan.
I actually I actually grew up on the you know teenager in the late 2000s, and on YouTube there were like the YouTube poop videos of using that content as the substance of the video, the visual substance of the video. And I don't know if the YouTube poop was any better or worse than the original show, but that's my experience with the show, being a late millennial as I am.
We mentioned some about the broader mythology and the various things that all these games sort of feed into. Josh, can you elaborate on like what is the mythology of Zelda, or what links what links all these together? Like, pun intended, I guess.
Yeah. Was it actually intended? I have to know.
It was not intended, so pun unintended.
Got it. Fair enough. Okay. I had to challenge you on that because I was curious. Okay, yeah, I will try to cover this to the best of my understanding and my cheat sheet to the right of me that I will admit that I have, because I am no lore master here. But um, so basically, and you like get like tidbits of this throughout the game. And honestly, if you really want to know, like just go like buy a copy of the Hyrule Historia online, and I don't think it's too expensive, like $20 or so. And it really just gives you a lot of like information about Zelda, and it's just like an officially like published thing. So though sometimes fan theory, fan made stuff can be really good. It's helped to kind of pull everything together. But basically, so it is like it's very mythological, just in the sense of just like the timeline. Like it has like gods and gods who were there either before time. I'm not sure exactly how it's understood in their culture. And one thing to note too is just like some of like the a lot of the influence on Zelda is going to come from like beliefs about like from like Japanese, like the Japanese Shinto religion. And I'm not going to even try to draw those connections because I don't really know anything about it, to be honest. But probably just the difference between like Eastern world and Western world in a sense. But people have mythologies all over the place, right? It's not just the Greeks, the Romans, and the Norse, and the Celts. In the East, they had them too. And so there's this era basically that takes place before the timeline, and it's really the like the creation of the world. And this is like kind of like thinking of just like the gods and like the Greek pantheon in a sense too. But basically before time, there's this place called the Still World where the god Null would just erase whatever was formed whenever it formed. And then there were these three golden goddesses that came upon it, and they imprisoned Null. But Null created rifts. And so these three gods, and their names pop up a lot through the series, but you have Din, the goddess of power, the creator of the earth; Nehru, the goddess of wisdom, the giver of order; and then Ferori, the goddess of courage and the creator of life. If you know your Zelda lore, just kind of given the general, you know that power, courage, and wisdom are the three pieces of the Triforce, the logo for Zelda. So that's where that connection ties in. They also they possess the Triforce, and they also protect it in a sense. But when they descended from heaven after creating the earthly realm, um, basically they gave the Triforce to the goddess Hylia to watch over it. But it was the demon king Demise who coveted it and wanted to take it as his own. And Demise is actually the final boss in. So Skyward Sword came out in 2012. That's one of the main like console games in this series for those who don't know. And 2012 was 26 years after the original game came out, but Skyward Sword is basically the origin story of like the Legend of Zelda series. This really introduces kind of like a lot of the mythology, the lore. It gives us Link and Zelda in like Skyloft, which is the original place that they lived. And Demise is actually the antagonist in that game. And basically Demise is like it's the Morgoth, or like if you're a Christian reading the Bible, or like even a fan of Milton's Paradise Lost, he's almost like the Satan-esque character. Like he's the rebellious celestial being that basically causes a lot of problems in the heavenly realm in a sense. But um this all like ties in with Skyward Sword basically in a way here. But eventually the goddess Hylia is actually reborn as Princess Zelda, so that's where that name comes from. So the land is Hyrule. The people are called the Hylians, and so that's the tie-in with Zelda and Hylia. But basically, like you get in, that's like kind of what happens before Skyward Sword, and then that's really the origin story where all those events unfold. You eventually defeat Demise. You live in Skyloft, which is like this area that the gods created to sort of like protect humans, but then you end up with like Link and Zelda end up on Earth afterwards. And then here's where it gets really kind of complicated is there's these timelines that are really introduced in the Zelda universe. And there's known to be like these three timelines, and kind of really the linchpin that decides where each timeline goes is actually the game Ocarina of Time, which we've already discussed here. And so Ocarina of Time, um, it's what like almost 30 years old, so I think like a little bit of spoiler territory is acceptable at this point. But basically at the end of the game, um you go through the passage of time, like probably like 30-40% of the game. 7 years you become, you know, 17-year-old Link. I think he's like 17, maybe 19, I think 17 though. But like that's where you play most like the rest of the game as the majority of the game. And at the end you fight Ganondorf, who is generally like the usual antagonist in the series. He's like what Bowser is to Mario, like Ganondorf is to Link in a lot of ways. But then after you defeat him, he becomes the demon, like the demon Ganon, and then you fight Ganon, and that's the end of the game. So the timeline comes in because you skip time in the game. The timeline actually comes in based on the events at the end of Ocarina of Time, and that's why I was just talking about all of that. But basically, there's a timeline called like the Fallen Hero timeline where Ganon defeats Link at the end of Ocarina of Time, but these figures called the Seven Sages, which are in that game as well, along with Zelda, they seal Ganon into what's called the Dark World, and that leads to the events of A Link to the Past. And then there's another timeline where Link at the end of Ocarina of Time, he goes back to Child Link's time to warn Zelda and the royal family, Zelda being the princess, like the king and queen being her parents, about Ganondorf and where Ganondorf is sealed in the Twilight Realm. And then this is where Link basically goes off on his own adventure to find Navi, his fairy, and that leads us to the events of Majora's Mask, which that's probably why Majora's Mask seems so like kind of disconnected from like the rest of the world, is that it's supposedly like in this parallel world called Termina, and is really kind of like a self-contained adventure. Um, but then, and that leads to the events of Twilight Princess as well, which is basically like where Link comes out of all of that. But then you have like the third timeline is the adult timeline, and that's where Link defeats Ganondorf at the end of Ocarina of Time, which is really like when you play the game, that's the one that you kind of think happens. So you defeat Ganondorf, you defeat Ganon as is like the plot of the actual game, and then basically Ganondorf is sent back and or no, Link is sent back in time, but Ganondorf eventually escapes in that timeline, and then he commands the Helmarock King to kidnap all the girls with pointy ears because he's hoping one of them is Zelda, and Zelda is of course like the bane of his existence in a lot of ways. Kind of reminds us of like Herod in the New Testament, like Pharaoh in the Old Testament, like in the beginning of Exodus. But That timeline basically leads to Wind Waker, and then Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. I don't want to speak to too much, but they kind of, I guess Breath of the Wild kind of takes place in that timeline where all of this stuff is basically just mythological in a sense. Like it's kind of like where Homer chronicled the things of the Trojan War that occurred way before his time via oral tradition. That's kind of, in my understanding, where Breath of the Wild is taking place. It's in a far gone age, way after all of this stuff, where all this stuff is kind of mythological in significance and essence, rather than a very clear cut, well defined piece of history, like how we'd understand, like I don't know, like Napoleon or the founding fathers or something like that. Um, and then I can't speak to Tears of the Kingdom because I haven't had time to play it, so maybe Dave can help me out there.
It would be spoiling Tears of the Kingdom to explain, but it does make Breath of the Wild a little more complicated. But I do like the idea that as you're playing Breath of the Wild, you do seem to find things that seem to hint that, oh, this is in the same world as the other Zelda games, which none of the other games had really done before. I mean, obviously some of them are direct sequels to others, like Phantom Hourglass is a direct sequel to Wind Waker, and then the Spirit Tracks is a direct sequel to that. But um, yeah, it's like that. There's this perennially returning evil force called Ganon, who has been making many, many attempts. And Breath of the Wild, it's like this is his last. He's putting all of his energy into one last attempt to try and achieve whatever his ultimate goal is and destroy the kingdom. Uh, but yeah, your talk about null and those sorts of things. I think that's the most recently worked in aspect of the mythology because null is the villain in Zelda Echoes of Wisdom, the one that came out just recently where you play as Zelda in that game. Uh, and I have never been one to really worry about the chronology. I'm just like, okay, new Zelda game, I'm gonna have fun. But yeah, I saw where uh, the original Zelda and the Adventure of Link, the second Zelda game, are supposed to be in this era of decline that is and that Link to the Past is a prequel to those. But the funny thing about the era of decline thing is that it's kind of their way of explaining why in the original Zelda there are no houses and no cities and no castle. Everyone's just living in caves around the map, even though it's really the technical limitations of the technology at the time. I think it makes for a funny kind of a retcon for the sake of storytelling. That the civilization is just scattered because Ganon has kind of momentarily achieved his goal, and everyone is sort of living in hiding. But one of the things that I love about the Zelda games is that there's a gravity to the stories. Like things go wrong that need to be fixed. Um, Instead of just being a straightforward, there's a bad guy, you've got to defeat him. Which, in the original Zelda, the stories that Ganondorf he's stolen the Triforce of Power. And Princess Zelda has broken the Triforce of Wisdom into 8 pieces and hidden them to prevent him from getting them. So then he kidnaps her and she sends her nursemaid Impa to try and find someone who could defeat Ganon. And then Link rescues Impa from some monsters and she tells him about it and he goes off on the quest to do it. But all of that is in the instruction manual and not in the game at all. Like there's a little bit of info on the scroll if you don't push start soon enough. And the second game is a few years later, and Link is now 16. So there's some kind of parallels uh, to the young Link and the teen Link in Ocarina of Time. But he turned 16, and the Hyrule Crest, as they called it at the time, which is the Triforce, shows up on his hand, and he shows that to Impa. And then she reveals, oh, the original Princess Zelda has been locked away in this room, and his birthmark or whatever it is able to open the door to this room where the first Zelda is laying like Sleeping Beauty, having been sleeping for generations. And then they find a scroll that only he can read. And it's interesting because it says we couldn't find anyone that was pure enough of heart that didn't have evil thoughts in the kingdom. So I cast a spell on the whole kingdom. So if someone had been brought up correctly and had had the right set of experiences and this inherent qualities to them, then this seal would appear on their hand and they would go off on the quest to then get the Triforce of Courage. And that's the first place the Triforce of Courage appears is in the second game. And so I like how they're building the mythos as the games carry on. Um, so yeah, the second one it's an outlier as far as the gameplay goes, but I do think it lays down some of the more important aspects of the series, where with the power and the wisdom and courage, sort of a not a circle, but the triangle of power, wisdom, and courage, and how they work together. And I always felt like it's interesting. It seems wisdom and courage, they're just great making qualities on their own. And power is always the problem. If you have power without wisdom and power without courage. So I think there's an interesting lesson there.
Yeah, that
Yeah,
is interesting. Um, and while I just can't at all speak to the distinctly Japanese influences in the way that you're laying that out, it sounds very much like a Western fairy tale, right? Like your Sleeping Beauty, you got to find the pure in heart to redeem true love, essentially, and to waken the kingdom. Like it's very Western fairy tale. And in fact, I find it interesting that despite all of these, what we might call pagan influences, and like the way that the mythology works out. I find it interesting that in the Link to the Past, when that was released, that there's official artwork coming out of like Link kneeling before a crucifix in a church. Yeah, I'll throw that up there on the screen when I post this to YouTube, but I put in the chat there. And so and even in I think it was in the first Legend of Zelda, in the Japanese version, there's even mention of the Bible, and so they're going out their way to tie this into Christianity somehow, even if it's sort of on the, I don't know, on the side level.
Right. And Nintendo of America at the time had a strict policy of wiping out any sort of religious symbolism. Like they even took the crosses out of, like the Castlevania games and things like that, which is really hard to believe. But yeah, that's because Link to the Past was actually called something of the Triforce of the Gods. It was the Japanese name of Link to the Past, and so they weren't gonna mention gods in the title of their games at all, even lesser gods. So they had to change it to Link to the Past.
I have to be at least a little bit grateful for that because I probably wouldn't have, in the household I grew up in, I probably wouldn't have been able to play those games if they were called Triforce of the Gods, like that lowercase g with the S for the plural and the like. It would have, yeah, I wouldn't have been able to play them. So I have to be a little grateful for that personally. Wouldn't have grown up with Ocarina of Time.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I got in a little trouble for playing Diablo back in the day.
It's okay.
Yeah.
I was never allowed to read Harry Potter, even though those books were huge when I was coming out. So, yep.
I had a friend who was made to get rid of Ocarina of Time once they got to the Deku Tree. It was all pagan. We have this talking tree, and yeah, and he's the one that gives the whole mythology that you laid out a while ago, Josh, with the creation by the three goddesses. So yeah, yeah, don't you couldn't play that part in southern Oklahoma with your parents in the room, apparently. Well, my parents were fine. I had reasonable parents. I don't want to judge other people's parents, but maybe they're just overly protective.
Talking trees are a dead giveaway. God forbid some mid 20th century scholar of Anglo-Saxon literature would who's also a traditional Christian would put talking trees in his novel.
Right.
So I think it would be profitable just to, and I'm sure people like probably know at least the names of the characters, but just kind of like talk about the actual recurring like main characters, protagonists, antagonists, or antagonists in the series. So obviously we have Link, and um, there's something I want to defend here that gets a lot of hate as a trope, especially in a lot of like different fantasy stories. But um, Link, like a lot of protagonists, is a chosen one figure, right? However you want to hash that out. Sometimes chosen one figures, in my opinion, are really obvious and not as obvious. But Um, I actually kind of want to take this chance, like just to defend the fact that um tropes are tropes for a reason. Like it's fine to have tropes. It's all about the execution of said trope that really matters. And um I do think it's fine to have like and even good to have like Link as a chosen one trope that he is because um he's not a Mary Sue or what do the people call it like a Gary Stew or something as like the boy version of that. But either way, it's like Link struggles. Like he has consequences for his actions. He has weighty decisions to make. He faces daunting intellectual and physical and spiritual battles in all of his journeys and all of the games, right? All of the adventures. But just kind of like defend the chosen one trope, even from a Christian perspective. It's like is the Bible like not just full of like chosen one stories in a sense? Like it's like you like Moses could have just if God wanted, Moses could have just been some random guy and like Aaron could have been the chosen one. He kind of is a chosen one in a different sense. Or it could have just been some random guy like in Israel and in Egypt that we never ended up hearing of because he wasn't recorded in the Bible, right? Like that guy could have been a chosen one if it was God's choice to make him one. So there's a sense where it's like some people for some reason just have these grand journeys in their lives that they have to take on, and they're not just a bunch of normal people who are not going to be remembered in history, like probably the three of us and anybody else that's listening to this podcast will be, right? Like you'll be forgotten in the historical records in a sense. And so I think there's a sense here where um, just defending like the chosen one trope in general, because it's another thing I've seen is like a flack for not just Zelda, but just general adventure and fairy stories, if you may, in general. So I kind of just wanted to defend that, and that's in um kind of like just an interesting perspective on the Link that I think is perspective enhancing, especially for those who might listen to this and who do have those sort of gripes towards these types of characters.
Yeah. I I think Joseph in the Bible is a good example of that sort of a character. Like he receives a prophecy, and from bragging about the prophecy to his brothers is the only reason that the prophecy comes true, because it causes the chain of events that leads to it. But you know, he just basically Romans 8:28 in action, that a lot of things are happening to him, but God is carrying him along through a lot of seemingly bad situations, and he is just being faithful to the God that he knows in those situations. And in the end, you know, many people are saved through him because of what God has done in his life. So, yeah, I think Link is like an agent. Like in the first Zelda game, he's not a chosen one. He's just a guy that Impa found, but then he turns out to be the chosen one in the second game. And in Ocarina of Time, he's the elf, but he's not really an elf. He was just like raised with him. Isn't that how it goes? Yeah. And I do think there's probably a little bit of a shallow aspect of that to make the player feel like, oh yeah, I'm special. I'm a special person. That's why I'm able to do all the things in this game. But it is also the events of the games that make him great.
And naturally, that's like in a story, it's different. It's the same in some sense. It's probably different in another. But in a game, it's like it's kind of like yeah, of course that's the character you're gonna play, right? You're not gonna be like um the magic beans guy or like the happy mask shop owner. You're not gonna be Midna, the guy that was always trying to keep you out from seeing the Deku tree and such things. It's like of course you're gonna be Link in that. Like it's how video games work for the most part. Like it's like you might not always be the most powerful or most chosen character, but a lot of the times you are, and this is an element in the nature of kind of just like sub creation, secondary worlds, like via the medium of video games rather than books in a way.
Yeah, I mean, in most epics, I mean, you're going to have a hero of the story, and the chosen one. I mean, obviously that idea can be kind of ham-fisted, but for the most part, I mean, the chosen one is just it's the person the story's about, and so why would you expect it to be anything different?
Yeah, it might not even always be like an extraordinary person. It might not even always be like an extraordinary adventure in a sense. I mean, going back to the Bible thing, it's like, I mean, obviously there's extraordinary aspects to like the character of like Ruth in a way, but she doesn't have this grand like 20 something Bible chapters long story like David does or something, but it's like that's the character that the person that God chose to give us for the that particular story in the grander um like biblical canon in a sense. So, but yeah, I think for the most part, yeah, it is going to be the hero, and it's like, yeah, why wouldn't it be in a way? Did we want to talk about, since we talked about Link and I already kind of discussed like Zelda's role and relationship to like the goddesses and such? Did we want to talk about Ganon and Ganondorf at all? I know we touched on them, but I think this is important because this is really our antagonist in the story for the most part.
I'd love to if you if you have more thoughts in that direction. I do think, Ganondorf doesn't appear until Ocarina of Time. It's always just this big fat pig guy before that is basically all he is. And he's not even in the second one. The the story is that his followers are trying to kill you because if they can sprinkle your blood on his ashes, that he will be resurrected. So when you die, and I think this is only in the American version of The Adventure of Link. When you die, it shows this shadowy picture of Ganon on the screen, and it just says "Return of Ganon," the end. With this, it's like the same laugh that Soda Popinski has in Mike Tyson's Punch Out, but this little on the screen. But yeah, so it's kind of a reveal at the end of Ocarina of Time that he becomes this Ganon that we've known from the previous games instead of the more slick, smooth talking. He's like the only male of the Gerudo, right? Like they have one, I don't know how they don't talk about how that works, but he's the only one born in however many years or something like that.
And I can't remember, like, that's a good point with like the male thing. And I can't remember if it's like, some, you know, bizarre and different version of some sort of like immaculate conception where like perhaps the gods interfere to make make Ganondorf a male somehow. I cannot remember how that works. It'd be worth looking into, but you are on the right track here where Ganondorf, that's how like they know who's going to be like the king or the leader of the Gerudos, right? Because every age, however long an age is, I'm not sure. There's like the begetting of a male who is basically an heir to lead an all female tribe in a sense, right? And yeah, that's like obviously we have that like Ganondorf is a Gerudo, right? He's from these races, and if you don't know, like Gerudos, they're basically like kind of like these like desert nomad, like desert bandit groups. They would probably, whereas like the Hylian people probably look more in the vein of like the, you know, some of the Norse or Germanic or Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of like medieval Western Europe. The Gerudos are going to be probably um more how we might think of like maybe like even like Assyrians, Babylonians, or Persians, and um like the ancient world, or maybe even some sort of other like mostly like desert race or tribe. But yeah, that's where Ganondorf ultimately comes from, and like that's why it's like why he's the king of them. But Ganondorf, I mean, no, I guess we'll actually talk about Ganon too for a second. But so Ganon is he's basically this reincarnation of what's his name? I just said it earlier. Demise, right? Like so that's the I think when Demise is defeated, and I'm going to paraphrase this because I don't have the exact quote, but he's basically says something to the effect of those who share the blood of the goddess and the spirit of the hero will ever follow in a cycle without end. It's something like that. That's not word for word, but this is like his reincarnation comes through this large blue pig demon, which is Ganon, right? But then that's the distinction between Ganon and Ganondorf, who is like Ganon is the incarnation of this pig demon incarnation of Demise. Ganondorf is the Gerudo leader. But interestingly enough, with Ganondorf, you really get because again, like it can easily be portrayed as like is Ganondorf um a generic villain, right? Is he just like a one-dimensional guy? Is he even like a twirly mustached villain in some sense? And I don't know really where you'd get that one specifically, but Ganondorf actually has like queer motives in Wind Waker, right? Like the Hylian, and I don't know how much of this is just Ganondorf's perspective or how much of it is the reality of the historic scenario. But the the Hylian people, they have a prosperous, vast kingdom, right? There's a castle, there's a market outside of the castle, there's usually like a field, there's Kakariko villages, there's all these places within the Hylian. It's a well-established, prosperous, like Western European kingdom. That's kind of how it looks in the games. And the Gerudo people, like I said, are desert nomads. So there's a sense where Ganondorf has this vengeance towards the Hylians, where his people were left out in poverty. They were left out in the desert just to fend for themselves, were and they were impoverished in a way and probably experienced famine, where the Hylians enjoyed the prosperous fat of the land and the prosperity of the kingdom in a sense. And so Ganondorf has a vengeance towards the Hylians and the royal Hyrule family because of that. And these motives become clear and fleshed out more in Wind Waker specifically, which I do think is one of not just aesthetically an interesting game and a fun game, and I do think it's actually one of the more well written games in the series, and that's one of the reasons for that. And that's actually Ganondorf is at his best in Wind Waker for that reason and for others. But I do find we actually do get clear motivations for him and reasons, and they flesh that out. And I think that's one of the that makes him a stronger character, even retrospectively looking back at the previous games.
Yeah, and Tears of the Kingdom actually gives a lot of interesting backstory on Ganondorf, a lot of new story for him. And I think it's fair to say, without it being a spoiler, that just right at the beginning, you sort of find the mummified remains of Ganondorf, and by taking a sword from his hand, Zelda gets transported into the ancient past. And so you as Link, you find some of the memories of her and who she was interacting with and the things that Ganondorf was doing. So, if you ever somehow carve out the time to play Tears of the Kingdom, I would even say um you could skip Breath of the Wild and play it. It's the same land, but it is a much better game in almost every way. Although I love them both. I was shocked at how great it was. But there's a lot of rich and interesting additions to the mythology there that may cause some problems with timelines that people had built in the past, but they seem pretty good at weaving everything back together.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. We've spent about an hour just kind of like talking about like meaning, the story, characters, themes, mythology, music, and all wonderful things that I think video games need much, much, much more discussion on. But I kind of we've wrapped up these game chats more in the past. I was wondering if we probably just like talk about like more like mechanical aspects or even just like stuff as simple as like favorite games, uh, favorite dungeons, and like all of that stuff. But you said something, Dave, that made me want to kind of tie in with that, where it's like I've heard that some people have like some really ambivalent opinions on like Breath of the Wild. I don't know as much about Tears of the Kingdom, but Breath of the Wild's been out for like 8 years now, so I know more about that. But I hear some people have a general ambivalence towards it. Some people say this is the greatest Zelda game ever made, at least up to that point, 2017. And then some people say this game has so many mechanical problems and it's really not very substantial because it's a big world with not a lot in it. What is your opinion on Breath of the Wild? I'd be curious to hear it.
Yeah, I think any of those things people complain about were by design, like they were the vision they had for the game. They wanted to create these wide open spaces that you were exploring, but it definitely breaks from the Zelda gameplay formula. I feel like it was getting a little tired though. Like Twilight Princess, I think was kind of the perfection of the here's a dungeon, you find a compass, a big key, fight the boss, get a heart container and a new item, and then you move on to the next dungeon kind of thing. Breath of the Wild tried to kind of circumvent that, and you can climb and you can, do cooking to make potions that help you to survive in cold regions, and there's hot regions. Um, but it still has, it's got the Zora, it's got the Gerudo. It has a bird race, the Rito, which they're in Wind Waker as well. They're a little more fully realized in these, and of course the Gorons, which we haven't really talked about the Gorons much. Um, but instead of having traditional sort of dungeons, there's these four great beasts that are these giant machines. Like there's an elephant one and a bird one, and they're more puzzles to kind of figure out how to get around and explore than they are traditional Zelda dungeons. But the weird thing was that at the time that it came out, I never heard anything but praise for it. And then a few years passed, and people started sort of like with Mario 64, people started trying to act like it was never good and that nobody liked it. And I, yeah, things change and attitudes change and the technology changes, like the camera controls on games from N64 are sometimes pretty hard to deal with now. But at the time, it all blew our minds just to have things in 3D, you know. But I loved it, and there are some areas that are kind of empty. But yeah, in Tears of the Kingdom, it's just chock full of things to do, and it's where it's the same really expansive map, but now it also has an entire world above that map and an entire underworld below that map of equal size, which is pretty insane. So there's, yeah, the childish sense of just I'm going to start off in this direction and see what I find that I loved about Morrowind back when it came out. Like I'm like, okay, I'm going to go to this town, and then I would never get there because I would stop at every cave and crypt along the way and forget what I was doing. It has that kind of an aspect to it that I really enjoy.
I'm glad that Elder Scrolls keeps rearing its head in here somehow. I was about 10 when Oblivion came out. That was my first open world game, and yeah, exact same strategy and approach. So kind of just further on that, mechanically one of the more interesting things to talk about with the Zelda series is the great question of what do you think are the most difficult temples slash dungeons in the series?
I mean, I still have PTSD from the Water Temple in Ocarina. I think that's everyone's go-to for that question.
Yeah, it's famously tough. And I think other dungeons that have that same aspect of where you change one thing somewhere and then it you have to find how that allowed you to get somewhere else or how to get here to change, the water level aspect of it. There in Twilight Princess, there's a sky temple I remember. I had some mind-bending sort of puzzles like that were you turning it over? I think you were flipping the whole thing. And some of those four sacred beast temples that I was talking about in Breath of the Wild had some tricky elements. Like you had to one of them that looked like an elephant, you had to move the trunk to different places to make water pour down through different areas to turn different wheels that would activate, different platforms and stuff. And so, yeah, that's the less straightforward they are, the more you can change things that make you need to revisit areas you've already been to, the harder they are to wrap your head around.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I definitely remember playing the City in the Sky Temple. That was it's one of my actual favorites aesthetically in terms of like just the puzzles too. It's actually one of my favorite dungeons, but yeah, it was certainly challenging. But I think one that doesn't get enough talk, um, the Water Temple in Ocarina of Time is hard. There's no doubt about it. But the Water Temple, um, formerly known as the Great Bay Temple in Majora's Mask, I don't know if it's just harder because for those who don't know, Majora's Mask has like a time component where the timer runs out and basically it's game over. Like it has a time based system to it, which some people obviously absolutely despise. But you gotta play the was it the Song of Time backwards and you get double the time. By the way, there's my cheat for you. But the Great Bay Temple in Majora's Mask is also just a very complex and difficult water dungeon or water temple, and it might just be because of the time limit that I thought it was harder, but I don't think I've ever been more stuck on a like just having to redo and revisit a temple until I finally beat it for the first time. I don't think I've ever spent that much time on a temple for like in that purpose. And then the Stone Tower Temple right after it, Majora's Mask, which is those are the last two temples in the game, and they really brought out they really brought out all the difficulty in those. Like those, they're very challenging. I think those were two of the harder ones in the series for me.
The clock being, the main boss in Majora's Mask was a great aspect of it. There was just this tension and this moon getting ever closer as you play. Like again, I love when developers put constraints on themselves and limited what they could do in the game by this time limit that they had imposed on it. And so I think Majora's Mask is just a really, yeah, it's very polarizing, but I like those kinds of time loop and I've got to try to make some tangible effort in these 3 days that I will keep with me when I have to start it back over and go on to the next thing. That was a lot of fun.
All right, now let's ask the ever so controversial Zelda question of and you don't have to give a particular order, and if you can't give five, it's fine. But if you can, what are your five favorite overall Legends of Zelda games? I don't know if Andrew has five. If you don't, that's fine.
Yeah, yeah. All I can go with is Ocarina, Majora, Link to the Past.
I would say Tears of the Kingdom, Link to the Past is amazing. I do love Wind Waker, but also at the time, Twilight Princess, like I said, I felt like it perfected the formula. Well, one of the things about Twilight Princess that I loved is it was one of the only ones where the economy made any sense. Like in Ocarina of Time, doing the most difficult thing in the game gets you the biggest wallet, and by the time you have it, you have nothing to spend any money on. So it's really pretty pointless. But Twilight Princess, you can do like all these building investments, to get bridges rebuilt. Like you can carry a ton of money, and there's actually stuff to spend it on, which I found satisfying. But yeah, and I've got a soft spot for the original as well, so I have to throw that in there.
Yeah, I mean, let's never underestimate the power of nostalgia and these kind of decisions. And so, like, I don't think Ocarina of Time could ever not be my favorite. It was the most important game of my childhood. Um, but if it wasn't for that, I mean, Twilight Princess might actually be my favorite. It certainly is, just in terms of like the dungeons and the boss fights alone, it has my favorite of each of those respectively, like in summation, in the entire series. Like I just think most almost all of the dungeons are excellent. The best ones are my favorite ones in the series. The boss fights are great. The whole wolf mechanic, I can take it or leave it. That's fine if people hate it or love it. I don't really have strong opinions either way, I guess. But I also love Wind Waker, Majora's Mask, and I'd probably have to throw Breath of the Wild in there just because I actually did play it and complete it. Um, I feel like if Skyward Sword came out on the GameCube or even the Switch, I would have put it on there instead of Breath of the Wild. But again, I was just really burnt out on using the Wii motes for stuff by 2012 when it came out because I had already had a Wii for 6 years. And I'd also, if I was a little bit older, maybe A Link to the Past would be on there. But I respect it. I think it's great. But that game did come out before I was born, and so I think my perspective on it, just being like 16-bit and all that, is just probably a little bit different. So I probably there's probably a level of appreciation that I just lack there because of my age. But I recognize it as a great game, that's for sure.
It was hard to pick. I forgot some of the games that you then mentioned. But there's not been one that I did not enjoy, frankly.
And even just like a plug for some of the games I mentioned, those are all main. They came out on the consoles. They're all like the games that come out on the consoles are generally like the big games, like massive budgets, massive production. They're hyped up for like a year or two or more, like before they come out. But even some of the handheld games, like Minish Cap, was really cool. That's like Phantom Hourglass was probably kind of hit or miss. There might have been some weird DS mechanics, like the stylus on the bottom screen that kind of messed with that a little bit. But Four Swords Adventures on the GameCube, my brother and I played that together as kids, and I had a lot of fun with that. So there's all sorts of stuff. And it links crossbow training on the Wii, obviously. How can you? No, I'm just kidding. It was okay. I mean, it was for what it was in the time. It was fun, but a lot of great like handheld games that are maybe don't get as much talk. They're still good though. There's a lot of those that are still worth playing, I think.
Yeah, yeah. I can't remember enough to say anything significant, but I do vaguely recall enjoying Link's Awakening, but I can't really comment on it.
My wife loves Link's Awakening. It's a pretty short adventure, and it falls pretty much completely outside of the canon just by nature of what the story is. There's kind of a hint in the name of the game right there. But um, I enjoyed the most recent one, the Echoes of Wisdom that I mentioned earlier, where Null is the villain and these rifts are appearing around the world. Um, it kind of has the aesthetic of the Link's Awakening remake that they did, but you play as Zelda in that game. And I've liked the way that throughout all these games, they have increasingly given Zelda a bigger role without emasculating Link or taking away from his role as the hero in any way. And they even managed to do that in Echoes of Wisdom, because at the very beginning, you play as Link trying to rescue Zelda. She's been captured by Ganon and she's in the crystal. But after you defeat Ganon in basically the tutorial stage, which is funny, you're getting sucked down into the darkness, and Link shoots one arrow that cracks her crystal before he gets swallowed up. So then she's able to break free. And then she's kind of going on a quest to get rid of these rifts as the priestess, basically, and to find and rescue Link. But as you're on your adventure, people are telling you about how great Link is and things that he's done for them, which I think is funny. And also, they've made it a part of the story that Link has literally lost his voice in that game, so they can have him still not speak, even though he's not the protagonist. But even some of Zelda's most powerful abilities, she just kind of takes on sort of a spirit form of Link for a few seconds until the meter runs out, where she has a sword and can do some of his moves. So I thought they handled it really well without detracting from Link or the main series at all.
I'm okay if we end it there unless other people have more things. Just kind of thinking of time here. I know there's a lot more we could say. I mean, I could probably like sit here and put David on trial and try to play Socrates and try to get him to defend why like Breath of the Wild is great. And I'd be interested in uh hearing more of those opinions. But yeah, a lot of things we could talk about.
Yeah, but good news is that we'll be meeting again to talk Zelda in just a couple days. Although um, anyone listening to this will have to wait at least a week, but that will be coming up soon. And so, Josh, thank you for leading this conversation. David, of course, thank you for your insights here. And I guess we will go ahead and close it there. And next time we will continue to talk Zelda with our esteemed guest. All right, until then, Godspeed. All right. Thank you for listening, and I hope that you enjoyed that. And I hope that you'll consider supporting what we're doing here. This is not my full-time job, but I would love for it to be, right? I would love for Mythic Mind to be my full-time job so I can spend more time giving you more and better content between looking at video games, looking at movies and shows and the other podcasts, looking at literature and great books and the other podcasts, and making just making content in this sort of domain of the Christian humanities, engaging with literature, ideas, culture, popular media, and so forth. And so, if you want to help me to do that even more, then you can head over to patreon.com/mythicmind, and that'll also allow you to join these conversations as your interest and schedule allows, and to just generally be part of our insider talks and planning. But for next time, as I said, we will continue our conversation on Zelda, but we'll be joined by Anthony Cirillo, who is something of an expert in this field. Until then, Godspeed. The Elder Scrolls in Philosophy, a 6-week course beginning in September 2025. I don't play many video games these days, but there are certain titles that have stuck with me, enchanting the mind of my youth and never entirely fading away. One of the chiefs among these titles is the Elder Scrolls, namely Morrowind, Oblivion, and Skyrim. The level of artistry, mythology, and lore of this universe is vast, and provides a strong representative for asking the question as to how video games might relate to literature as an art form. Where might it rise to such a level? Where must it fall short? And what unique advantages does it possess? For this 8-week study, we'll be seeking to answer these questions while analyzing various elements of this franchise, specifically focusing on content related to Morrowind, Oblivion, and Skyrim. We'll be taking a look at the philosophy of RPGs and considering the philosophical implications of character creation and formation in an open-ended series such as this. And we'll be looking at the relationship between in-game, religion, lore, and ideas with our primary world, philosophical, and religious concepts. Each week will include 1 to 2 videos addressing these topics, ongoing Discord conversations, and live meetings. You are also encouraged to spend at least a little time playing one of these titles each week as a launching pad for conversation. Join us in Tamriel that we might better understand our primary life here on Mundus. Enroll today by going to patreon.com/mythicmind and checking out the shop. Or you can access all courses that begin during your subscription period if you purchase a Tier 3 annual subscription. Get that Tier 3 annual subscription and I'll give you that special code for your All Access Pass. I hope to see you there.